We'll discuss today a little bit about the Indian of Bishul Akum. That we're familiar in the Torah with the concept of kosher. The Torah lists kosher animals, non-kosher animals, animals that chew its cud and then split hooves are kosher, animals that don't are not, fish with fins and scales, and the different types of birds. And in addition to kosher, we know you can't mix milk and meat together. The Torah says it 3 times. That it's prohibited to actually cook the milk and meat, and to eat the milk and meat that was cooked together, as well as getting benefit, giving it to your animal. It's not an issue for the animal's point of view. The issue is for me, you can't have anah. In fact, there was many years ago, there was a whole big issue when they found in one of the kosher stores, they had cat food or dog food that had basar v'cholav in it. So it was a problem, so I guess they changed it. But you can't get hana from basar v'cholav. So we're going to focus on the prohibition of Bishul Akum. The Gemara tells us, the Mishnah tells us in Avodah Zarah, Lamed Hey Amud Beis, it talks about that food that is prepared by a Gentile, by a non-Jew, is a violation of Bishul Akum. The rabbis made a rabbinical prohibition of Bishul Akum. If a non-Jew cooks the food, and we're talking about 100% kosher. If the food's not kosher, there's nothing to talk about. A Jew could cook the food, it wouldn't help you. But if a Gentile, even if he cooks 100% kosher food, there's a special rabbinic prohibition that one cannot eat the food. What is the reason that you can't eat the food? They just so that's what Rashi writes in Avodah Zarah on Daf Lamed Hey Amud Beis, and this seems to be the standard approach. Now we know there's a prohibition of intermarriage. The Torah is very concerned about intermarriage all the time. That's the blessing and curse of living in an open society. The curse is that the intermarriage rate is much higher. So the Torah is very concerned about intermarriage, and they know through social settings, eating, drinking, bars, that you tend to socialize a little too much, and therefore it can lead to intermarriage. So therefore, there are many halachas in terms of Bishul Akum, Pas Akum, Stam Yenam with the wine. And basically it's all midrabanan. The rabbis wanted to safeguard against intermarriage, so they said you can't have a Gentile cooking the food for you. That's one approach. Another approach, this one in Rashi and Avodah Zarah Lamed Ches Amud Beis, that the concern is that since a Gentile isn't familiar with kosher, he might think it's kosher, but doesn't really know all the details, and he'll end up putting non-kosher food in, and you won't know the difference, and therefore you'll be eating non-kosher. So there's 2 schools of thought on what is the nature of the prohibition of Bishul Akum. Is it a din of intermarriage, or is it a din of you're going to end up eating macholas asuras? And in fact, Rama writes, and we know the intermarriage is terrible in both directions, but it's much worse when a Jewish boy marries a Gentile girl than the reverse, because since the child goes by the woman, so for a Jewish woman, so it's not a good thing, but at least the child's Jewish. But if a Jewish male marries a Gentile woman, so therefore all the kids aren't going to be Jewish. And therefore, it's like the Rama writes, it's like Yaro v'al Yavor. That's one of the things you can't do. And in fact, the old minig in Europe was, even if someone did this, they sat Shiva, because they thought this is the end. In other words, this is the end of the line. So they point out that intermarriage is bad in either direction, but it's much worse than that. So those are the 2 schools of thought. My nafkamina, what's the practical difference? What's the difference if I can't eat food cooked by a Gentile because I'm concerned about intermarriage, or because I'm concerned about them giving me non-kosher? Either way, I can't eat the food. So what is the practical difference? So poskim discuss, perhaps one nafkamina is you have a Jew who is an old day avodah zarah, an idol worshipper, a mummer, he doesn't keep anything. A mummer will call it tarakuo. So what about if he cooks for you? Are you allowed to eat, again, assuming he cooks 100% kosher food for you, is it a go? So if it's a concern of intermarriage, so then it shouldn't be an issue, because even though he's a mummer, doesn't mean his daughter is, and she's Jewish, and you can marry her. But if the issue is kashrus, so the same way we're concerned about a guy mixing in non-kosher, so too a Jew, old day avodah zarah, we're also concerned because he doesn't know anything about kashrus and he might mix in kashrus. So that's a potential nafkamina the poskim bring down. As well as another nafkamina perhaps is based on a famous Tosfos in avodah zarah, where they quote from Rabbeinu Avram ben David, the Rabbi, who writes he wants to limit the prohibition of Bishul Akum. He says Bishul Akum only applies b'beis ha'akum but not b'beis Yisrael. If you're cooking the food in a non-Jewish home, then Bishul Akum applies. But if you're cooking the food in a non-Jewish home, in a Jewish home, in your own home, so then it doesn't apply. And Rabbeinu Tam vehemently disagrees and says there is no difference between a Jewish home and a non-Jewish home. There's a categorical prohibition of Bishul Akum. So it's a machlokes in the Bali Tosfos, the Rabbi and the Rabbeinu Tam, on whether Bishul Akum applies in the house of Yisrael or not. What is in the Kudas HaMachlokas? There are different ways of learning it, but perhaps one way is like we mentioned. I think in the Mordechai mentions this as well, some Rishonim, that if you hold the reason is because of kashrus, they were concerned the non-Jew might serve non-kosher food, but if he's cooking in your house, so the assumption is the food is kosher, that mitigates the concern of kashrus, and it should be okay. But if the issue is intermarriage, so what's the difference? Intermarriage, maybe it's worse, the daughter will be in your own home, you get to see her. So if it's intermarriage, it's a low plug, it wouldn't make a difference whether the guy cooks the food in his own home or the Jew's home. So if this is true, it would come out that the Rabbi seems to hold that it's a din of mixing up the kosher food, hence he's lenient. And Rabbeinu Tam is machmir because he says it's based on intermarriage. There seems to be a machlokas rishonim. How do we paskin? To the Ramah quotes lechatchila, one should not rely on the Ravid Shita about cooking for a guy to cook in your home, but b'di'evet, once the food is cooked, so there's more room to be meko. And perhaps also ties into, but what about the kelim? What about the vessels? So some achronim, some poskim are more strict on the vessels, on the kelim, that you have to kasher them, than they are on the actual food. Why is that? Because the food is already cooked, it's a done deal. You have to do something with the food, so if you don't eat the food, you're going to have to give it away. It's going to be lost. But the pot, this kasher the pot. So what's the big deal? It's not a big deal to kasher the pot. So therefore there are those who are, there's a machlokas rishonim, whether you accept the Rabbi or not, and there are those who make a compromise, they accept the Rabbi regarding food, but in terms of the kelim, they say that perhaps you need to kasher them. In fact, this issue on whether you need to kasher them or not, that depends on a different chakira. Where the Chuvas Haran discusses, we'll have to get into in terms of what's pshat. We say Bishul Akum, you're not allowed to eat the food. In a case where Bishul Akum prohibits the food, we didn't get to all the leniencies yet, but in the place where Bishul Akum has to prohibits the food, what is the reason behind it? Is it that basically, it's a din in this staying, making sure you don't socialize. It's an issur on the gavra, it's on the person, but it's not. There's nothing inherent about the food that's non-kosher. It's a din of you want to avoid intermarriage, or no? It's a din of macholas asuras. So once Chazal said a non-Jew can't cook, so when a non-Jew cooks it becomes, so to speak, non-kosher. So it becomes a din of macholas asuras. So that seems to be the issue. If it's an issue of iskarvus leisha, so then why should you have to kasha the food? There's nothing wrong with the food. If it's a din of macholas asuras, it would make sense to kasha. The Ran seems to tie in different things about whether you need the issue of, if it's a din of macholas asuras, so then you need shishim. But if it's not a din, all you need is rov. So he basically ties in a couple of issues. He seems to say that it's more in iskarvus not to intermarry, but yet he seems to conclude that one has to kasha the pot, which seems to apply it's more din in the chafsa. So people achronim deal with that issue. That's the shaila, major machokas rishonim on the food and on the pot. So and then there's a different sheet. There's a compromise. Perhaps the food is mutter, but the kelim have to be kasha. So we'll have to continue next time. We'll get into different kulas, different leniencies of Bishul Akum. Continuing our discussion on Bishul Akum, we discussed last time the issue of what is the nature of the issur. Is it a din of intermarriage, to prevent intermarriage, or is it a din that you're afraid you're going to eat non-kosher? So and the nafkamina was whether if you have a Jewish old day about a zara, so if I'm into marriage, you're not worried this kid's Jewish, but in terms of kosher, we're concerned. Or perhaps the machokas in the Bali Tosus, Rabbi Tam and the Rabbi, on whether the heter of Bishul Akum only applies in a non-Jewish home, or also applies to a Jewish home. Rabbi says only in a non-Jewish home, and then Rabbi Tam says in both. The issue seems to be, if it's a din of intermarriage, like Rabbi Tam seems to be saying, then who cares? It should apply equally. But if it's a din in macholas asuras, so we should only be in a Jew's home, we're not as concerned. And we pointed out that Ramah b'diavad goes with the Ravid that if the food's already cooked, so perhaps you could eat it. But regarding kashrus of the pot, those are more machmir. And why do we have to kasher the pot at all? So that's the Tshuva Taran as a chakira, whether Bishul Akum turned something bechafsa into a macholas asuras or not, even though the food is kosher. So it could be totally on that issue whether the kelim whether the vessels have to be tova or not. So getting to some more leniencies of Bishul Akum, there are many, since Bishul Akum is only d'Rabbanan, so there are many leniencies. So one of the famous ones is the Gemara talks about if it's nechal kamo shehu chai, if it's something that can be eaten in its raw state. If you could eat carrots, if you could eat other vegetables, or whatever we're discussing it, the way it is now, and you just you cook it because you want to make something, have it differently, so it's not considered significant bishul, and therefore the halacha is there is no problem of Bishul Akum on carrots or the likes. And another famous heter the Gemara gives is in Avodah Zarah Lameches, if it's Ola al Shulchan Malachim, or if it's Einu Ola al Shulchan, the heter is if it's Ola al Shulchan Malachim, if it's food that would be served at a royal banquet, then it'd be a problem. But if it's not food that would be served at a royal banquet, so then they won't be subject to the laws of Bishul Akum. In fact, they have a discussion in terms of Tosis in Avodah Zarah Laman Aleph Amud Beis talks about how are we allowed to drink beer? Why isn't there a problem with Bishul Akum? So Tosfos has two answers. One reason is because it's Eino Ola al Shulchan Malachim. It's not subject to the king's table. And secondly, since water is the main ingredient to beer, so therefore we view the whole thing as water, and therefore it's not a problem with Bishul Akum. My nafkamina, what's the practical difference? Either we're saying beer is okay, either because it's Eino Ola al Shulchan Malachim, it's because it's Eino Ola al Shulchan Malachim, or because it's mostly water. The nafkamina, perhaps some achronim bring down, the nafkamina would be is, what about drinking coffee? Is coffee a problem? So if you assume the issue is, like number one, that it won't be served at the royal banquet, beer, I'm not sure it won't be today, but if it wouldn't be, so the coffee would be. So it would be a problem. But if the issue is that it's mainly water, so then it won't be an issue. It wouldn't be a problem. That's what they point out. And the two major leniencies is if it's nechal kashemuchai, it can be eaten in its raw state, or Bishul Akum, if it's Eino Shulchan Malachim, that's the issue with the beer and the coffee. There's interesting chumrah of the Chaz and Ish. Rav Shechter says over that Rav Shimon Schwab, who lived in Washington Heights for many years, so he had a brother in Bnei Brak he used to visit. So apparently the Chaz and Ish in Europe is a big snoo, and no one knew who he was. And he got some type of dream, or that you have to come out in the open now, and now you're in Eretz Yisrael. So the question is, how far do we take Bishul Akum? So in other words, he said he had a bunch of questions. First he spoke with the Chaz and Ish, and he had a very good time, friendly, etc. And then when he got to halakha questions, the Chaz and Ish became very serious, and this answered asur, mutter, yes, no. So when he asked him a question about Bishul Akum, is sardines Bishul Akum? So Chaz and Ish said asur, they are. So he didn't want to mention Chayib Ozer, so he mentioned, but aren't there those who say it's permitted? So how do you deal with that? So the Chaz and Ish said the Queen of England eats sardines for breakfast, because that's a very strict definition. That if you go by what you had for breakfast, good, a lot of things you could have that people would have, but the point being, Pashas Ola Shulchan Malachim means it will be served at the royal table, not the king right at home. He'll eat anything for breakfast. He might have Cheerios. That doesn't make it Ola Shulchan Malachim. So that's the Pashas, but the Chaz and Ish is Bachmir. That would be considered. That would be a problem. So we have the two heterim. We have it's Ein Ola Shulchan Malachim, and we have number one, that is you can eat it raw. Regarding a third kula, they discuss is, let's say the non-Jew is burning his house down, but instead of burning his house down, he makes chal, he bakes something. Are you allowed to eat it? So Gemara seems to say over there that since you didn't have anah, you didn't think about doing it, it just happened, it's okay, because it's not something where you actually made an attempt to do, etc. So there seems to be reason to be meko. And then there's a Aruch HaShulchan, like some have it about if something that only can be eaten with bread. If it can't be eaten with bread, so then it's not subject to Bishul Akum. It's a whole discussion about desserts, whether desserts are subject to Bishul Akum. According to the Machaber, they seem to be. According to the Pri Chadash, he might exclude desserts. And in general, so in Bishul Akum, we're very mako, so a lot of times we take different snifim to be mako. Even though the Vilna Gaon, Rav Chaim Moser, Rav Chaim Volozhin, so even though they point out that regarding desserts, that the machokes, the Pri Chodesh and the Machaber, whether one can be machmir or not, the Aruch HaShulchan likes the dessert, likes the thing without having bread. Many don't like that kula. And even regarding the first kula about eating things raw, so therefore the question is, what about fish? People eat sushi, so maybe sushi is considered davar shenachal chai. So they point out, well, it depends on which town, depends on where you are. So I think the Aruch HaShulchan writes, you go by the Medina you're in. And if they eat it, then, that's the definition. And others point out, even if they eat sushi raw, it doesn't mean they can eat regular fish, because sushi is full of rice, other things, and therefore maybe only then they'll have it together with the spicy mayo and the sweet sauce, but eating it alone wouldn't be enough. These are some more kulas of Bishul Akum, of eating it raw, so therefore cooking it's not significant. About Eina Ola Shulchan Malachim, about the Hana part, not doing it in, not the kavanah of cooking. The desserts issue with Aruch HaShulchan. So they point out, the different kulas involved, and that's why we generally do is we combine shitas. Svek Sveka, this snif, because Bishul Akum is only D'Rabbanan. But we'll see how well, so the Vilna Gaon, because the Vilna Gaon was very sure of himself, so when he passed in some way, he had Rayas Berura, so you can't use any snif, either Lahak or Lahachmir. We're never that sure, so we combine different shitas. But that's why, one has to study well the laws of Bishul Akum. It's very nogeya, but you also have to know the kolam, because there are many exceptions to the rule regarding Bishul Akum. So continuing our discussion on Bishul Akum, so an interesting shaila comes up regarding what do you do on Shabbos? Someone who is a chola, someone who is sick. So if you're a chola sheyesh bo sakana, your life's in danger, so you cook yourself. It's not an issue. Someone else cooks for you, you cook for yourself. You have a chiyuv too. What happens if you're a chola she'ein bo sakana? It's not life-threatening, but you're a chola. So then, we know as a general rule, Amira l'nachri, telling a non-Jew to do something is permitted. So someone's a chola she'ein bo sakana, and they have to eat, they need something to be cooked. So al tilcha Shabbos, one is permitted to get a guy to cook the food. So the commentators ask, that might be true al tilcha Shabbos. What about Bishul Akum? What about the prohibition? The Mishnah tells us in Avodah Zarah about if a non-Jew cooks up food, makes food for a Jew, it's prohibited to eat. So how do we deal with that shaila? So the different schools of thought in the Rishonim. So the Ra'ah writes, it's not an issue at all. It's not Bechlal Bishul Akum, because everyone will figure out that we're not worried. The issue is chasana, it's intermarriage. Everyone knows it's a special situation. It's Shabbos, I can't cook, I have to get a guy to do it. So it's not Bechlal Bishul Akum. So of course on Shabbos, the whole reason you're cooking the food, the chola could eat it. And there's a separate shiloh, what could others eat when you make it cooked on Shabbos? So on Shabbos the chol ki, but according to the Ra'ah, once Shabbos is over, not only can the chol eat the food Motzai Shabbos, you don't have to cook more food because they'll say, well, it's only Bishul Akum for Shabbos. He's saying it's not B'chlal Bishul Akum. It's 100% mutter. Not only could the chol eat the food after Shabbos, but acherim, even other people can eat the food. That's the shita of the Ra'ah. It's not Bishul Akum at all. On the other hand, you have the Rashba, who is much more machmir, and he says it doesn't make a difference. There's no difference of Bishul Akum ben b'chol ben b'Shabbos, whether it happens during the week or whether it happens on Shabbos. There is a din of Bishul Akum. Alright, so what are you going to do? So of course on Shabbos the chol eats it because he needs the food. But after Shabbos, he could cook up his own food. So according to the Rashba, after Shabbos no one could eat it. According to the Ra'ah, everyone could eat it. And according to the Rashba, no one could eat it. And there seems to be a third sheet, Rabbeinu Yerucham, others, that they say, B'makam choli or gazud rabbanan, that they lifted the ban to, so according to the Ra'ah, it's not even Bishul Akum. It's not, according to the Rashba, it's Bishul Akum and it's Asur. According to Rabbeinu Yerucham, they lifted the ban, B'makam chola. That's the question, how far it goes then according to, so clearly on Shabbos chol can eat. There's a discussion in whether, Motzai Shabbos, the Machokas, the Rashba and the Ra'ah. So this is, so it's not necessarily the accepted Shita, but there is a Shita that writes, B'makom choli lo gazud rabbanan, and therefore this isn't just true on Shabbos, but halacha l'maisa for many elderly people, sick people, they can't cook anymore on their own, and they have a nanny who's not Jewish, or they have a woman who's coming in. So it isn't necessarily lechatchila, but there are some shitas that say that when is in that situation, they're permitted since it's the only way they could eat. So chol shein bo sakana. Of course, if other people come, you shouldn't necessarily rely on it. It's okay for the chola or the zakim, but not for, because we don't generally accept it, and even if we do accept it for them, it still wouldn't necessarily make it permitted for Chayra, because it's B'makam Choli, only for the Chola. And then a related issue, assuming that there is a problem with Bishul Akum, so what about, this is just the food you can't eat, what about using the pot? So that's a machlokas, the Rashba and the Rush, but the Bishul Akum extends to kelim, to pots and pans as well. The Rashba argues that not only did the rabbis forbid the eating of the food, but they also said, if any hot food is cooked in there, so then the kelim as well are not kosher, and they'd have to be kashered. The Ran disagrees and says it was never extended to, the Rush disagrees and says it was never extended to kelim, and the issue seems to be about what's the nature of the takana. Those who say it's asur say it's a din of machalas asur, as Chazal said that you treat it like non-kosher. And others say no, even though we can't eat it, but it's not a din of machalas asur, it's a din of preventive ways to intermarriage, and therefore, but it doesn't apply, they never extended it to the kelim. So Shulchan Aruch quotes both views of the Rashba and the Rush, and he seems to say the Rashba seems to be the main view. So lechatchila anyway, one, if they can, one should try to kasher the kelim. Perhaps b'di'evid, if food was already cooked in the kli, so then it would be okay. Certainly if it's eino ben yomo, certainly if it's more than 24 hours. So therefore, anyway, minat Torah. Once you wait 24 hours, it's an eino ben yomo, it's nosin tam with gam, you could use kelim for milk and meat, or you could use a non-kosher kli after 24 hours. Midrabanan, they made a gzeira ben yomo or to eino ben yomo, that they're concerned that people are going to confused with Eino Ben Yomo Pat, they're not going to wait. So really, Minat Torah, you don't need, it wouldn't have been necessary to have, the two sets of dishes. But either way, there's 2 days, it's the Machokes, the Rashba and the Rush quoted in Shulchan Aruch. The Mechaber L'Chadchila seems to say we should try to follow the Rashba, but the Eved, perhaps one to rely, even if food was cooked in a Ben Yomo pot, that the food, the food could be eaten. And we find in general, the Shulchan Aruch brings down that even though by Bishul Akum, as we mentioned, many leniencies already, but one more is regarding the context of koshering kli cheres. Let's say, in general, a pure earthenware kli cannot be koshered. And however, there's a sheet of the Baal Itzer who says that no, it is very hard to kasher on it. It can't be. If you do it 3 times Hagala, so then it works. So we usually don't follow the Baal Itzer. However, even the Shulchan Aruch says regarding by Bishul Akum, assuming you're going to go like the Rashba, which the Aruch HaShulchan thinks is the normative approach. So then regarding Bishul Akum on Kli Cheres, so even though assuming you're machmir, or assuming you wouldn't kasher earthenware in general, by Bishul Akum, there's room to be mekel like the Baal Itzer. Whether it's glazed earthenware, that's a different shaila. Different sheets is what to do. There are those who are mekel in both directions. If it's glazed, on one hand they say it's earthenware, so regarding tefillas kelim, you don't need it. And regarding kashrus, it's not a problem because it's glazed, so therefore the glass keeps it out. So either way, we have many issues regarding Bishul Akum and many leniencies. So we discussed what's the heter for a chola she'ein bo sakana. Some say chola she'ein bo sakana all year, all the time, can rely on this shita, and for those elderly and sick, but the acherim should rely on it. But regarding on Shabbos, we had 3 shitas, the Ra'ah, who said it's not even Bishul Akum because it's recognizable that it's a special scenario. The Rashba says it's Bishul Akum, ben b'Shabbos, ben b'chol. Of course, the chola can eat the food, but after Shabbos he can't. According to Ra, everyone can eat the food. And according to Rabbi Yerucham, perhaps that b'makom choli they lifted it, but only the chola can eat the food. After Shabbos, no one else. And we discussed the Machokas, the Rashba, and the Rush regarding kashering the Kalim. The Aruch HaShulchan seems to say the normative halach is like the Rashba, but it's 2 days in the Shulchan Aruch, so l'chadchila one should kasher it. But the Evid, if one doesn't, so there's what to rely on as well. Certainly if it's an Eino Ben Yomo pot, and perhaps even if it's a Ben Yomo pot, because we find many leniencies by Bishul Akum, and the Shulchan Aruch brings the one with Kli Cheres, that even though if you assume that you can't kasher earthenware, you can't kasher china, but if you do Bishul Akum on the china, even the Shulchan Aruch says we could rely on the Baal Itzer, that we could do Hagala 3 times. One of the prohibitions in the Torah is the prohibition of kosher, of eating non-kosher. And there are many different levels of kashrus min haTorah midrabanan. What we're going to discuss tonight is the topic of Bishul Akum. That Bishul Akum means cooking of a non-Jew. We're talking about 100% kosher ingredients, except that if a non-Jew is involved in the process, so the food becomes non-kosher. Midrabanan. Biblically speaking, it's kosher food. Rabbinically, you can't eat it. So there's a discussion among the Rishonim. What is the reason behind the prohibition? Why did the Rabbi say that one cannot have food cooked by a non-Jew? So Rashi in one place writes, because Shema were afraid that the guy might put non-kosher in. But obviously it can't mean non-kosher, or else we're talking about a subject d'oraisa, we're talking about a doubt on the biblical law. And therefore what he means to say is, no, it doesn't mean right now. Right now you know it's 100% kosher. But it's not a good idea. If you have a guy doing the cooking, ultimately there's going to be mistakes made. They're not so familiar with the laws of kashrus, and therefore you'll end up eating a davar tamei. So it's a gzeira, you might come to eat non-kosher, but the more classical reason given by Rashi and Tosfos, Rashi elsewhere and Tosfos elsewhere is gzeira mishum chasanos. We're concerned about intermarriage. And there are many halachas the rabbis made regarding with wine, bread. It's all about social issues. So if you get too close, you'll intermarry. So they want to put some boundaries, and not to go at the bar, not to be cooking and eating together. So the rabbi said, Gzeira Mishum Chasanos. And of course, even though they're both very bad, but obviously if a Jewish boy marries a non-Jewish woman, that's even worse. That's the Arovi Yavor, and the minhag in Europe was to sit Shiva because that's the end. But if a Jewish woman, no matter what, the child is Jewish. Not that it's a good thing, but at least the child is Jewish. So, but either way, the two schools of thought midrabanan about why is one prohibited to eat food cooked by a guy. Number one is because the concern of non-kosher, and secondly the concern of kashrus, the concern of intermarriage. So my nafkamina, what's the practical difference? Either way, I can't eat it. So if I can't eat it, what's the difference if I can't eat it because of the concern for kosher or concern for intermarriage? So the post can deal with different nafkaminas. One would be Yisrael Mumar, a Jewish old day avodah zarah, who basically doesn't keep anything. So for certain halachas, dino kagai, but he's definitely Jewish. So the question is, if he cooks the food, is that a problem? So if you assume the reason is because of kosher and he doesn't keep kosher, so he's no different in that sense like a guy. He's not observant in the laws of kashrus, and therefore the concern would apply. But if the issue is intermarriage, even though he's an idol worshiper, but he has a very firm daughter, very religious daughter, you can marry her, so therefore wouldn't be a problem. So that's a discussion among the poskim. Many poskim are mekel, and they assume intermarriage is the main reason, and therefore the mekel of a mumakot is not considered Bishul Akum. Another potential nafkamina would be a galach, a priest, someone who is definitely took his religious ties and he's not going to get married. So he doesn't have a daughter. So therefore, what about if a priest cooks for you? Is that a problem? So some say, yeah, low plug, it doesn't make a difference, even in that case. And others say that we're not concerned since there's no daughter. So it could be if it's a kashrus issue, so then we're concerned. Since there's no intermarriage issue, so we're not concerned. So that's a discussion among the Rishonim and Achronim. A third nafkamina potentially would be if a guy cooks in a Jewish home. So Tosfos and others are close to Rabbi Avraham ben David derided that the whole prohibition of Bishul Akum only applies in a non-Jewish home. But in a Jewish home there's no concern. And Rabbi Tam disagrees and says no, the Bishul Akum applies whether it's in the home of Israel or the home of a non-Jew. So it's a machokas among the Rishonim. Pashas, we don't accept the right anyway l'chadchila. But that's another potential heter in the house of a Jew. Another heter the poskim discuss is what about someone who's working for me? Let's say an eved or a shifcha. I hope it's a real eved, a shifcha, it's a working relationship. So then the more Rishonim who say that then we're not concerned. But today we don't have avadim u'shvachos. You just have workers, so maybe a nanny, a working relationship isn't a social issue, and therefore maybe there's no concern of chatzon. So that's a discussion among the Rishonim, but many still say that's not enough. And so, to rely on the Rabbi l'chadchila about the Beis Yisrael, to rely on Eved Shvachas Nani, L'chadchila, we don't necessarily find it so simple to rely on. We'll see perhaps when we put a snif to l'hakel, a svek sveka, maybe we could join a couple of forces together. But these aren't so strong. The Gemara never mentions them. However, there are some definite ones that the Gemara mentions that's not open to dispute. One is nechal kashulchai kamochai. So let's say you eat apples, carrots, other vegetables, tomatoes, and you make tomato soup out of it. You cook the tomato, you cook the carrot. So since you couldn't eat the food raw, so therefore it's not considered enough of anah, and therefore there is no problem of Bishul Akum. It's interesting, machlokas Rishonim regarding Hilchos Shabbos. Let's say I want to cook an apple or a carrot. So some say, well, it's already, this is like we see by Bishul Akum, there's a nechal kamo shulchai, so therefore you're only softening, you're not really cooking it, perhaps it's not a deraisa. Another Rishonim saying no, it's a deraisa. It's a special halacha. By Bishul Akum, this is special heter, but it's nothing at all to do with Bishul on Shabbos. That's a whole discussion about another one the Gemara talks about. Let's say you have a lot of ingredients. So some are nechal shulchai, some aren't. So let's say coffee. The Tosfos is already asked in Avodah Zarah, how could we drink beer? So one answer to Tosfos is it's not fit for it's not ola shulchan mulachim. And the second answer is you go by the ikar ingredient. The ikar ingredient is water, and therefore there's no bishul akam. My nafkamina is coffee. Coffee is ola shulchan mulachim, but its main ingredient is water. So that's a discussion. So some are meko that by coffee, because that's the minhag olam is that the main thing you'll be drinking is the water, even though you're not going to be drinking that you want the coffee, not that water. So it's not simple in lumdis, but the minhag seems to be meko. And of course, it's especially regarding Bishul Akum, it goes by time and place. In other words, the Gemara talks about at certain times they used to eat raw meat, but they wouldn't eat raw fish. Today, it's just the opposite. We know about sushi, and therefore, depending on where you are, whether raw fish is included in the prohibition or not. Then you have another one the Gemara says is if it's eina ola shulchan malachim, if you wouldn't sign it, if you wouldn't serve it at a royal banquet, so then it's not considered fit. It's not considered fit, and therefore there's no problem with Bishul Akum. And therefore you have to. So the OU's involved talking to when they have the Hanukkah party at the White House to see what they serve, what they don't serve, and etc. But Pashas, it's not just what a king eats, what a president eats, only if it be served at a royal banquet. The Chazon Ish, they say over, Rav Shachta says over in the name of Rav Shimon Schwab, that when he went to Eretz Yisrael, he asked the Chazon Ish a couple of shilas, and one was about sardines, so he said Usr. So Rav Schwab said, well, aren't there those poskim Meko? He said to him, the Queen of England eats sardines for breakfast, which implying that according to the Chazon Ish, it doesn't have to be at a royal banquet. Anything a queen or king eats, it's under the rubric of Bishul Akum. It would be too many things not included then, but we don't assume that way. And again, it's the same thing in terms of what type of food would be served. Certain types of fishes, if it's done nicely, will be served. But if you have the can of salmon, I don't think, maybe fish sticks. If you do, wacky mac or macaroni and cheese, but do all these fancy pastas, maybe Alfredo, whatever the different pastas are, maybe the different pastas as well, they're going to keep. So either way, those are two the Gemara gives is, the Gemara says, Eino ola shulchan malakim, if it's not fit for a king's banquet, then it's not included. And secondly, we said if it's eaten raw. So there's a further kula brought out in the Gemara. Let's say a Jew is helping out in the process. He's mishtatif in the process. So at what point is what's considered helping out? So the Gemara tells us about a Zara regarding pas akum, which in general we have more heter because alechem yechya adam, that people need the bread. So Pas Akum, it says, the Gemara says, if you put dough in the oven or you light the fire, that's enough. So that's the Meizer Shaila and the Rishonim. Since Bishul Akum came before and it's more machmir, does the heter of Bishul Akum apply or not? So that seems it's a machokas Rishonim, which is a machokas of Machaber Ramah. The Machaber is machmir. It only applies to Pas Akum. It doesn't apply to Bishul Akum. There's no heter. According to the Machaber, the Jew has to be involved in the whole process, and according to the Ramah, that even a Jew can be involved. So Chacham Avad Yosef has a tshuva, since most hashkachas, shuls, restaurants, everywhere are mostly Ashkenaz Hashkerim, and they rely on this heter, so could a Sephardi eat in these places? So he wants to be Mako. He says perhaps maybe it's a Svek Sveka. One subject is maybe passing like the Ravid, that's Beis Yisrael, it's in the restaurant, perhaps also about Avadim, at least it's a something. And maybe the Ashkenazim got it right that if a Jew lights the fire, it's enough. So based on Svek Sveka, he is Mako. The Ramah even goes further, not only if you light the fire, but even if a guy takes a light. Let's say I lit a candle, and then a guy takes another light from my candle and he lights it, so the Ramah is even Mako in that case. And that's what many rely on today with pilot lights, that you light in the oven and everything else the guy does. And in fact, even today they have set up in remote places. You could be in Toronto, you could be in New York, and they go ahead and they light the oven. And then there's a further heter of a Jew adding to the fire, that not only does he have to turn on the light, but any type of process the Jew's involved in, that's also cool. In fact, the Ramah brings down, you could just hashloches kitin, so what does that mean? So let's say the oven gets to 500 degrees. So putting a light bulb in will make it 501 degrees. Is that enough? So some say it's a joke, others say it's enough. Depending which hashkacha you go by. And then one more heter is, let's say it's already, the guy cooks it, and then the Jew takes over. It depends at what point does he go. If a guy cooks it to machal ben drosai, and a Jew cooks the rest, so then there's room to be mako. But that's a discussion regarding Hilchos Shabbos, whether cooking after machal ben drosai is considered a deraisa or not. So the Ramah is even mako over here, as long as even if it's machal ben drosai and you make it especial or gamres, it's okay. So the main heterim are ein ola shulchan malachim and eat ruah, but then the Ramah even takes it further about eshmi from one fire to another, throwing in some chips, turning on the pile light, turning on electric bulbs, etc. Then there's a further discussion about what about the pot, if they become non-kosher or not. The Machokas Rishonim, we'll have to get into it another time.